Okay, I want to go back to the adaptive immunity and talk about adaptive immunity. 3 characteristics of the adaptive immunity that we began and started with were specificity. And make sure you understand one of the differences between adaptive immunity. Another name for adaptive immunity is called acquired immunity. Sometimes it's referred to as acquired immunity because the adaptive immunity is not a natural part of your body systems like the innate immunity is. It has to be acquired through experience, is a good word, with the particular antigen. It has to be pre-programmed, and it has to be specific. It is pre-programmed to a specific antigen. So that's why you have a variety of immunizations, so that your immune system has literally adapted to that pathogen. And so the next time you experience that pathogen, next time you come in contact with it, your immune system will immediately destroy it. You won't even know it. So we have our 3 characteristics. Specificity. The adaptive immune system responds to one thing at a time. All right? Then memory. This is the function of the B cells. The B cells, we kind of left off with that. That's the humoral arm, and I'm going to finish it. The B cells will program themselves to that particular antigen from a particular pathogen, and they will respond to it immediately. So we have specificity and memory. Those 2 characteristics lead to and allow adaptive immunity to have the 3rd characteristic, immediate and heightened response. Of course, that's to the second encounter. So adaptive immunity is exactly that. Your immune system will adapt to specific pathogens as it encounters them. That's why it's called adaptive immunity. Same thing if we go back to innate immunity. What does that adjective mean? It means naturally present. It's a part of your makeup. So you need to be able to contrast adaptive immunity versus innate immunity. So specificity, memory, and then immediate and heightened response on the second and subsequent encounters. 2 arms. The cellular arm is said to be cell-mediated. That means it involves cell-to-cell interaction. The first cell involved is the macrophage. The macrophage is the most important white blood cell. It is in part of both the innate immunity and the adaptive immunity, okay? It is able to do the phagocytosis. It eats it. It engulfs, ingests it, destroys it, but it also does a second thing. It presents the antigen on its own cellular surface. So what does that do? That triggers the adaptive immunity. It presents that antigen to the T helper cell. So the cellular arm involves complex cellular interactions. The macrophage presents the antigen to what cell? T helper. And then the T helper turns on other cells. They're called effector cells or functioning cells. The cytotoxic T cell, what does that sound like that cell does by its name? Cytotoxic. It kills other cells. It kills foreign cells. It also turns on the B cells. And that's where we left off. The B cells will then be stimulated to divide, and the B cells will be programmed specifically to that single antigen presented to the T helper cell by the macrophage. So it's cell-mediated. We're working between the macrophage first. It presents the antigen to the T helper cell, and then the T helper cell turns on the other cells. The T helper cells is a mediator. It turns on the B cells. It programs the B cells to that particular disease because that B cell will attack that particular antigen. That's what an immunization does. It programs your B cells to that particular antigen. Okay? Then the T helper cell also turns on other kinds of T cells, the cytotoxic T in particular, which will destroy foreign cells. That is the cellular arm. It's cell mediated. It's a interaction between the macrophage, the T helper cell, and then the effector cells, the functioning cells. It could be the cytotoxic T, it could be the B cells. That leads to the second arm where we left off at the end of the period, ran out of time there, the humoral arm. The humoral arm is antibody mediated. The humoral arm is what your antibodies do. What are antibodies? They're also called immunoglobulins. Okay? We call them commonly antibodies. And these are produced by the B cells. Remember, this is a type of white blood cell. It's a type of leukocyte. And the B cells produce antibodies or immunoglobulins. Immuno and globulin. They use the letter capital I, little g. These are proteins. See the word globulin? And of course immuno tells us their function. These are proteins that circulate in your blood that match the same antigen presented by the macrophage to the T helper cell, then to the B cell. It matches the same antigen. Remember, adaptive immunity responds to a particular antigen. The innate immunity takes care of your general problems, doesn't it? So these are proteins. They're Y-shaped. Literally, the protein lines up in a Y shape. And right here, the shape of this Y fits perfectly the shape of the antigen. This happens on a molecular level. It's complex and very specific. And certainly designed by God, not a product of random mutations in evolution. So these are proteins. They're produced by the B cells. They circulate in your blood. This part, the active part of the molecule, fits the antigen exactly. So what does that do? That's how we're able to get rid of that antigen. We're going to do basically 5 things. The antibodies. This is the humoral arm, or the antibody mediated. This is in the blood, okay? And the receptor part of this protein, this active part of this protein, fits that antigen exactly because it was programmed to. Okay? And there are 5 functions of antibodies. The first one is called agglutination. Okay? We've got 5 functions here. Agglutination is kind of a fancy way to say clumping. What these molecules do is they attach to those antigens and make a very elaborate lattice work, a clump. So you have the antibody, the AB, and it attaches to the AG. They fit exactly, and so it agglutinates. Okay, that's just like I said, fancy for clumping, agglutination. Very helpful for the white blood cells if all these antigens are clumped together. Very helpful. They can be captured and destroyed. And that's what we want, because we don't want the organism or whatever the problem is to colonize and proliferate and start destroying tissue, start releasing toxins, start causing disease. Another thing antibodies can do is they can be programmed to a specific toxin, the botulism toxin, or other toxins that can be produced by cells or produced by whatever. So they are antitoxins. They inactivate toxins so that they don't cause any damage. Antitoxins. Antibodies, these proteins, these Y-shaped proteins, our immunoglobulins, are able to neutralize toxins. Okay? So they also can inactivate pathogens. Let's say we have bacteria cells that are foreign and causing problems. If they're in the bloodstream, and if you have antibodies against the cell surface of that bacteria, you're going to have hundreds of antibodies just completely coating them and attacking them. And that brings us to the fourth. They're said to be, this is an O, opsins. Guess what this other end can attach to? This other end can attach to a macrophage. So it's going to help the macrophage do its functions. It's going to help the macrophage engulf and ingest. That's phagocytosis. And it's going to also help that macrophage capture the antigen so it can present it to the T cells and cause even more immune response. So this immune system is very complex. It overlaps. It works both, all the different functions are working together to destroy the foreign cell, destroy toxins, or destroy whatever has essentially attacked the body. Then the fifth function is stimulation. It's going to stimulate other mechanisms in the immune system. It will stimulate other mechanisms in the immune system. So, antibodies are very important in assisting the adaptive immune system, assisting the cells. And what we want to do when we have a vaccination is stimulate the B cells to produce immunoglobulins. But then, one more thing with the humoral arm, with the B cells. The third idea here is we've got our antibodies being produced by the B cells. Here's what our antibodies do. The third thing I want you to know about the humoral arm is that the B cells also will divide and produce memory B. So we're going to have B cells that produce thousands of antibodies directly programmed to whatever our problem is. And our B cells will also divide and produce a memory B. And that B cell stays in the body for long periods of time. And then what happens the next time we get the same antigen? We already can rapidly produce these antibodies a second or third or fourth time. That's how the adaptive immunity can be specific, it has memory, and it can respond immediately to the second, third, fourth, fifth, subsequent encounters. Okay? That's the adaptive immune system. It has those two main arms. All right, let me give you a quick cell review. Last thing for immunity. Cell review. What are the agents of the immune system? I'm just going to review and try to get you to have the different cells straight in your mind. What are the agents of the immune system? It's the white blood cell, the so-called leukocytes. There are two very important, first of all, phagocytic cells, cells that can do phagocytosis. There are many white blood cells that can do phagocytosis. The first one I want you to know, as mentioned before, is the neutrophil. The neutrophil is the first responding phagocyte, the first responding white blood cell. It is primarily a part of the innate immune system, and it is going to destroy whatever is causing tissue damage. And these are very short-lived cells. Your body can produce them very quickly, and they are the first responders. They will also be the mass casualties during an immune response, will be these white blood cells. You'll have mass casualties involved here. They are the first responders. Okay? The second phagocytic cell is the macrophage. The macrophage is the most important white blood cell. It is in both the adaptive immune system and the innate immune system. It is the main phagocytic cell. It can be in the blood or in the tissues. It can migrate out. It's found both. The neutrophils are kind of limited to the bloodstream. It is also the antigen-presenting cell for the adaptive immune system. It literally presents that antigen on its own surface to stimulate the T cell and start everything going on in the adaptive immune system. So those are our two main phagocytic cells. Macrophage being the most important. Remember, the macrophage is phagocytic and it is also antigen presenting. Then those are our two main phagocytic cells. Then the T cells. T cells. The T cells are technically called thymus-derived lymphocyte, but everybody calls them T cells. The T stands for thymus. There are basically three main types. There are other types, but they involve other problems, which we won't deal with. T helper. What does T helper do? It turns on the adaptive immune system by activating the B cells. It activates the B cells and it activates other T cells, such as the cytotoxic T that will destroy that cell that's causing the problem, the cell to which that antigen belongs. Then the last type of cell are the B cells. These are also lymphocytes. It's called the bursal equivalent. That's where it gets the B, which is kind of an old name, but it is still retained. B cells. These are also lymphocytes. Very similar type of white blood cell to the T cell. These mature in your lymph tissues and in your lymph vessels. T cells have two important things. When the T cell is stimulated, it will divide into more of the same kind of B cells and produce antibodies or immunoglobulins. It also will produce the B memory cell that remains in the system, remains programmed to that particular antigen. That's where you get, this is what we're trying to do when we're vaccinating. Program B cells. So then if you come across the measles virus, you won't get the measles because the virus will not have a chance to proliferate. Okay? That is the immune system. Now I want to apply some issues to the immune system. The first issue that I want to apply to the immune system is vaccinations. Vaccinations, a lot of people have very strong opinions about them. And I think a lot of the reaction to problems with vaccinations is an overreaction. And it tends to be by people who are kind of leaning to the alternative medicine type things. And so you don't want to get caught up in the hype of vaccination scares. Vaccinations, first of all, what is a vaccination? It is the deliberate introduction of an antigen. It's the deliberate introduction of an antigen. They're not going to give you the pathogenic organism. They're going to give you a part of it, or a killed virus. They're not going to give you the disease. So that's a misconception. They're not going to give you the disease. They're going to give you a part of the organism, an antigen from the organism. So they're going to deliberately introduce an antigen from a pathogenic organism. They don't give you the organism into the body to trigger the adaptive immunity's memory. We're going to deliberately put part of a pathogen, an antigen, into the body to trigger the adaptive immune system's memory. We want to go through this entire cell-mediated process. Okay, so that the next encounter with that pathogen, your immune system's going to recognize it because it's programmed to part of it. And then the disease, that's very sound medical thinking, okay? It's not nearly as dangerous as some of your anti-vaccination people say. But let me preface that. Are there side effects to vaccinations? Yes. Do people have adverse reactions to vaccinations? Yes. But anytime you do a medical procedure of any type, you are taking a risk. So we always do risk-benefit. Okay, and a lot of the times with these, there have been severe reactions to vaccinations, but they're very rare compared to how many people get the vaccinations. Okay, so the purpose of a vaccination is to pre-program the immune system without getting the disease. Pre-program the immune system without getting the disease. Second purpose, to provide an immediate and heightened response to the second encounter before disease can occur. If we have a heightened and immediate response to the antigen, we're not going to get the disease. So we're going to respond and destroy well before disease conditions occur. So we want to provide that immediate and heightened response. Okay, next. Vaccinations are medically sound. The theory behind them is very good, and even the practice of them is very good. Both the theory behind how vaccinations work, which I've explained to you, and the practice of vaccinations, especially in the United States, is medically sound. Okay? So, both the theory behind it and the practice. As far as the practice goes, do we have viral epidemics in the United States? You and even I have no experience with that, do we? When's the last time that happened? Polio? Okay, my grandparents. Your great-grandparents. Okay. Influenza? What has happened to the rates of childhood death in the United States from infectious diseases? We don't even talk about it. It's not an issue, is it? Why? Vaccinations. Also, sanitation and cleanliness and medical technology. But isn't it smart to prevent the disease instead of deal with the disease? So, we have prevented viral epidemics in the United States. We've actually eradicated childhood diseases. Polio. In fact, how many of you have had a polio vaccination? They don't give it much anymore. Why? Don't need it. Why don't we need it? The disease hardly is present. And then also, we've almost eliminated measles, mumps, and rubella. How many have had the measles? I haven't had measles. And what about smallpox? Smallpox, for sure. You'd have to be as old as me to have gotten a smallpox, or a world traveler to have gotten a smallpox vaccination. Stop giving them the 60s. You got one? Military. Yep. That's because you're not staying in the United States. So, vaccinations overall are medically sound, both in theory, behind how it works, and in practice. Last point, there are risks. Let's not put our head in the sand. There's always a balance. There's always another side to the coin. First of all, though, keep in mind that you are not given the actual pathogen. You're only given the antigen. So it's not like they're injecting people with polio or diphtheria, okay? And tetanus. They're not giving you the organism. They're trying to program you against the toxin, okay? So it's not like they're injecting you with smallpox. Maybe they did that when they first started, but they don't certainly do it anymore. There are severe risks, and most of the time the risks involve other parts of the vaccination. They used to use other ingredients to deliver the vaccinations and so on, but that's been studied and a lot of that's been eliminated. So there are severe risks. You could contract the disease in some cases of some vaccinations, but not really. The big problem is allergic reaction. And of course, a severe immune response is a second problem, which would be high fever. And that can cause brain damage. There's been a controversy about, do vaccinations cause autism? That connection has not been medically made. Okay, so that's the big thing with vaccinations. It's going to cause autism. Or I know somebody who has autism and it showed up after a vaccination. The cause effect there is not very well established. Last, myths about vaccination. Myths about vaccinations. First myth, vaccines cause autism. That has not been established. Second myth, vaccines contain toxic chemicals. That is an overstatement. Yes, there are different things besides the antigen in the vaccination. It has to be delivered in some type of medium. Another myth, vaccine-prevented diseases aren't dangerous. Vaccine-preventable diseases aren't dangerous. Well, let's think about a few of them. Smallpox can be deadly and very disfiguring. Polio is chronic and debilitates people permanently. It's a muscle problem. I guess you could say measles aren't that bad, but that's not true because of high fevers. And depending on how old the person is, there's a lot of issues with that. Another myth, too many vaccinations overwhelm the child's immune system. This one, I can understand a lot more than the others. And of course, then what you want to do, if you want to play it safe with the vaccinations, is you talk with a doctor about it. All right, and then maybe you might want to space things out or whatever. There's nothing wrong with that, but I don't think you really need to be concerned. Okay, so myths about vaccinations. And make sure you remember that they're not injecting you with the organism, okay? Next, current issue involving vaccinations is the HPV vaccination. Now, I've just told you that vaccinations are safe, and I think they are. Does that mean you'll never have an allergic response, or you won't know of someone who's had problems with a vaccination? No, that does not mean that. But there is the other side of the coin. Should we vaccinate against sexually transmitted diseases, which is what HPV does? Okay? HPV is the vaccination touted to prevent cervical cancer in women. But the root of that cervical cancer in women is a sexually transmitted disease because it's caused by a virus. What's one of the modes of pathogenicity of a virus? Cellular transformation. So does this virus trigger cancer? Yes, it does. But the problem is, how do you get the virus? I told you it was a sexually transmitted disease, and it is. So, do we want to take a risk? I told you there is still risks with vaccinations. We can't pretend that there aren't risks. We can't pretend that there aren't allergic reactions, can we? They are rare, but why take a chance on a vaccination that touts itself as a cancer preventative when all it is trying to get around what? Lifestyle choice, right? So, do we want to, and the government's really big on this, they want to vaccinate both 9 years old and up girls, and then they said, well, we got to do the boys too, because we don't want them transferring the disease. Well, I guess. But it's a sexually transmitted disease. So is it necessary? Do we want to take risks of, there have been severe reactions to this vaccination, and it's relatively new, meaning it's not tried and true like MMR, your measles, mumps, rubella. And anytime we try to vaccinate against sin, in a sense, what do you think God thinks of that? Do they have an HIV vaccination? No. You know why? Viruses are clever. They mutate. So this year's vaccination has to be updated. As a matter of fact, the AIDS virus is really good at mutating because of the type of virus that it is. So I don't think they'll ever have a vaccination to protect you from any of these viral sexually transmitted diseases. Keep in mind God's sovereignty, okay? So it does not make sense, and it's unnecessary for Christians to vaccinate against sexually transmitted diseases. And what does the Bible say about those types of sins? Where do we receive some of our punishment, some of our reaping, let's put it that way? Where? In their own body, right? So do you think our vaccinations are going to counteract what God has said in the Bible about those types of sins? It's not. So it is not a vaccination. This is not a vaccination against a childhood disease. Is it on the same level as vaccinating against measles, mumps, rubella, tetanus, diphtheria? Is it in even the same ballpark as far as our regular vaccines? No, it's an attempt to vaccinate against immoral behavior. Is this problem prevalent in the United States? Is this disease prevalent? HPV? Yes. Many young people have this disease already. Why? Because we're not vaccinating them? No. Why is their lifestyle choices? So this is an attempt to vaccinate against a sexually transmitted disease. And of course, they have a nice cloak of nicety to put it in. Oh, we're going to prevent cervical cancer. Do you understand the thinking and how this is working? This is an issue that you need to probably in the near future, it's going to be harder and harder and harder to say, nope, I don't want my girl getting that, or my son. Right now, it's on a state-by-state basis. So this is something, and the other problem with it is it gives a false security. I'm vaccinated against that. I can do what I want. Well, the Bible says you reap what you sow. And I don't think God's going to let this vaccination attempts prevent what he has already said will happen. It's still true that you reap what you sow. You reap to your flesh, especially in immoral ways. What are you going to do? You're going to reap. And where are you going to reap? Okay? A lot of it will be with disease. What does Exodus say? None of these diseases. Do we have to worry about HPV? No. Maybe eventually we will because it'll be so prevalent in our society. Okay, vaccinations.